This is the news, and you are on Breakthrough Part 2. Part 2 of our post-election special, if you will. Countdown to Chaos continues. I'm at least one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear.
And I'm Monica Cruz.
We
How
are.
are you feeling tonight?
I mean, you know, it is what it is. There's a lot of things that are out here, a lot of things that are up in the air. I'll say, as we always do, we got fantastic guests for you, fantastic analysis, zero corporate spin coming to you here, so we are definitely outside the spin zone. But before we get started, if you could, take this second and share this stream. Wherever you are watching, let whoever follows you follow us. I think we have a fantastic lineup of people. Everyone you know deserves the opportunity to see this, so please, if you can, take a chance right now and hit that share button. We're going to be joined by Dr. Gerald Horn. We're going to be joined by Lee Camp. We're going to be joined by Dr. Jody Dean. So we have a fantastic show lineup for you here. So again, take the time and share this. Now, quite a bit continues to be up in the air. The presidential race, as it were, continues to be more or less deadlocked. And what we want to show you here first is a scene from Detroit, Michigan, where there was an attempt by supporters of President Trump to prevent the counting of ballots there in Wayne County and in the state of Michigan more broadly.
Stop that count! Stop that count! Stop that count! Stop that count! Stop that count!
Well, there you have it. That was Detroit earlier today. Unfortunately, for those people chanting "Stop that count," they did not stop the count. So this was not a reverse or a repeat, I should say, of the Brooks Brothers riot in 2000 in South Florida. This time votes were counted. And in fact, the votes that came in the city of Detroit, at least for now, have given the edge in the state of Michigan to former Vice President Joe Biden in his race against Donald Trump. Also earlier in the day, President Biden, for those who maybe haven't looked at this since last night, also was able to pick up Wisconsin. But there's quite a bit out there. We want to just move immediately to our first guest, and we are very honored here to be joined by Dr. Gerald Horn, who, among other things, is the Morris Professor of History at the University of Houston. Dr. Horn, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. And I guess I just want to start with this. I mean, I think there's a lot of people, certainly those on the quote unquote political left, wondering, how did this happen? Why is it so close? Obviously, some of the oldies but goodies in the United States, white supremacy and anti-communism, have been blamed. But I think a lot of people are looking at President Trump having done, markedly better than himself or other Republicans in recent memory, maybe since George W. Bush, amongst Latinos, not a huge vote amongst African Americans, but certainly better than Mitt Romney did, 40% of union households. And I think some are asking what really went wrong. So, I mean, that's my first question to you, Dr. Horn, is how do we really parse what happened here and who or what is responsible for, at the very least, a very close presidential election and a blue wave that never really seemed to come ashore?
Well, in no order of importance, let's start with the pollsters. Perhaps the pollsters misled us. Perhaps the pollsters are no more rigorous and scientific than a shaman or a witch doctor. No insult intended to shamans or witch doctors, by the way. But we also need to look at the Trump coalition. It's a broad coalition. It includes members of the U.S. ruling elite, particularly Texas oil men. It includes a goodly number of the Euro-American middle class. And you mentioned a segment of the Euro-American working class. For example, exit polls suggested that in the state of Ohio, which Mr. Trump won by 8 points in 2020, just as he did in 2016, that 55% of union households supported the Republicans.
Wow.
And of course, union households usually are more opposed to the right wing than are non-union households. To a certain extent, I think that in order to get a firmer grasp of what happened on election day, you really need to do a deeper dive into history. And you really need perhaps to revision what we think we know about U.S. history. I've argued in a number of books and numerous media appearances that a cardinal principle that has driven the organizing of the United States of America has been class collaboration. Someone needs to write a book that suggests that class collaboration may be the highest stage of white supremacy. That is to say that when the European invaders crossed over the Atlantic to drop into North America, it included the rich, the poor, and the middle strata, all bound and determined to seize the land of the Native Americans. And if they were lucky, particularly the poor, they could get a portion of that bounty and stock it with the free labor of enslaved Africans. That has been an animating principle of the United States of America. That class collaboration has not stopped to this very day. And I found it striking that in that scene from Detroit that you just showed, in a city that's about 88% Black, I did not see a darker face in that room. We should not find that surprising. We should find that to be a par for the course. I should also say that a major victor, I'm afraid to say, of the events of November 3rd are the members of the U.S. ruling elite who are hostile to Trump. What I mean is, from their point of view, they have apparently eased Mr. Trump out of office, although there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip, so we shall see if that actually takes place. And at the same time, it appears as of this moment that the Republicans have continued control of the Senate. From their point of view, that means that the Democrats will not be able to push aggressively with regard to raising taxes on the 1%, or student loan forgiveness, or any other progressive measures. And that means that will lead to frustration amongst the Democratic Party base, which then could allow for a return of the Republicans in 2022 and 2024 with a figure less polarizing than Mr. Trump, whose polarizing obviously helped to generate and gin up a significant turnout amongst the opposition to the Republican Party, which of course is not necessarily viewed in a positive light by many. With regard to the Black male vote and the Latino vote, I'm of two minds about that. On the one hand, I think that the Black male vote turning to Trump has gotten an overdose of publicity, if you look on Google News, for example, particularly when you consider we're only talking at most about 15% turning to the Republicans. That means that if you could get Euro-American men, Native American men, Latino men, Asian American men to vote 85% against the right wing, this would be a different country in a different world. At the same time, I should also mention that there is a danger, and I'm referring to some of the work on slavery, right, that if we're not able to halt this neo-fascist train in its tracks, you will find certain Black people who say, you know what, maybe we need to compromise.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's an important point. I mean, obviously we've seen it historically. This is not, I mean, these obviously is historically distorted, but Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, some of these issues when there are very, it seems as if there is no other option really to white supremacy, which, in some ways brings me to another question about how we even ended up here, which is, I mean, the system itself. I mean, this entire electoral college system that obviously favors sort of compact minorities over popular majorities, or at least in certain circumstances, maybe this to some degree being one, certainly the Trump election in 2016. I mean, the fact that we, can election after election after election have someone get vastly more votes, but not become the president, or it be questioned whether or not become the president. I mean, obviously the roots of that seem deeply important, and understanding that piece of it in terms of the structure of the United States and what it's designed to deliver, as sort of a governmental entity.
Well, as you know, the Electoral College was invented in the late 18th century as an anti-democratic, anti-majoritarian maneuver in order to empower a minority of slave owners, particularly Virginia slave owners. That is to say that it's no accident that before 1861 in the U.S. Civil War, a disproportionate percentage of U.S. presidents were either slave owners or particularly Virginia slave owners. That carries into the 21st century, where you see that a vote for president in Wyoming is worth more than a vote for president in California, or in New York. In other words, the Electoral College is operating the way it was intended to operate, to empower conservative minorities. Obviously, it seems that we, at some point, are going to have to grapple with that contradiction, that anti-democratic measure, because, as I said before, it's not clear as of this broadcast that Mr. Trump can be kept from being returned to the Oval Office in January. We'll see, but if so, that'll be just another time when a person who got the fewest amount of votes was elected. Think of Al Gore, for example, in 2000. Think of Hillary Rodham Clinton, for example, in 2016. This is becoming all too repetitive.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the one question I have for you is how does, I mean, obviously this is an interesting time. I mean, there's the pandemic, but, we're also in the midst of an uprising against racism here. And at least my reading of it, I could be wrong, I guess we'll see, if Joe Biden is able to succeed here and become the president, which at least it's leaning in that direction, but Republicans hold the Senate. It seems as if you almost have sort of a grand coalition effect, the right wing or the far right sort of in power. I mean, and it does seem, despite what has seemed like an upsurge in liberatory activity, it's not really finding much of a voice inside of the political system. I mean, how important does that make the independent, well, I don't know how independent it is, but it should be independent activity of the Democratic Party? I mean, the street movements, the strikes, all the things that I think have given people some hope over the past 3 or 4 years in terms of shaping the political environment moving forward, knowing that some form of relatively to significantly right-wing dispensation will be seated in Washington.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. As a matter of fact, one of the points that I've been stressing whenever a microphone has been put before my face in the wake of this election is that the labor movement, the Central Labor Council in New York City, the Central Labor Councils from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the AFL-CIO headquartered in Washington, D.C., really needs to consider seriously that no matter who is in the Oval Office as of January, February, that there should be a massive march on Washington in the spring in order to push for labor law reform, which in turn would increase the number of members in unions, which would basically augment their treasuries, which could then be poured into labor education, because obviously we have a lot of work to do with regard to educating a segment of the working class away from this voting for the right wing. As a matter of fact, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that we may be faced with the dire and absurd prospect of many progressive Democrats, for example, the Squad, for example, pushing for a major stimulus package to rescue people from the horrors of eviction and hunger in early 2021. And then that'll bring people to the streets, but that measure will be blocked in Congress by Mitch McConnell, who many people in the streets will have voted for. That's the kind of absurdity that we may have to confront. So obviously we have to see this particular moment as a state of emergency where militant, if not drastic, action is now the order of the day.
Dr. Horn, I want to ask you about Black voter turnout. In 2016, we saw the largest drop in the turnout of the Black community in 2 decades. To me, that signals that neither parties are offering a program that really speaks to Black America. And of course, as you mentioned, there's been so much talk on the Black vote, Black voters deciding this election. Of course, we see in this Black radical tradition, Malcolm X famously saying white liberals are more dangerous than the conservatives because they are the smiling fox, while the right wing comes at you with those open jaws, but no matter what, they'll both eat you. I wonder what your thoughts are on which party has done worse for Black America.
An appropriate question, no doubt. I think that a historian looking back at this particular moment, the early 21st century, will be struck by the fact that the party that has tended to get a significant percentage of the black vote oftentimes has been led by an individual who has made a career out of jailing and imprisoning their constituency. Look at Mr. Biden and the crime bill of 1994, for which he's apologized, for example. Look at Hillary Rodham Clinton and her rather indelicate remarks about black youth being super predators when it comes to crime. Look at the way that Senator Harris earned her spurs by being a lock-em-up district attorney in the city of San Francisco. Now, of course, we recognize that part of the problem is this anomaly and contradiction in the U.S. political system. That is to say that oftentimes we're presented with an alternative of vote for the neo-fascist Republicans or the neoliberal Democrats. And so black voters, seeing that particular alternative, and given the fact that the mainstream media oftentimes has a media blockade on parties of the left and third parties, which makes it very difficult and problematic for them to get out their message. Therefore, many black voters perceive, and I underscore perceive, that the only game in town is the Democrats. But as I said, that may be changing, and not necessarily for the better. Reference my earlier comment about presumably the vote of blacks for the Republicans went up a notch in 2020, a very troubling and dangerous signal for us all.
I wonder, Dr. Horn, what you make of a figure like Kamala Harris, the self-proclaimed top cop of California when she was the state's attorney general. Someone who is really, I would say, to the right on a lot of issues than most mainstream Democrats when it comes to the system of mass incarceration, dealing with policing in the United States. Now, of course, we've seen this historic movement demanding justice for killer cops sweep the nation, really changing the hearts and minds of Americans. Polls showing that more and more people are recognizing the racism so inherent to the system, the racism so inherent to the institution of policing in the United States, and this is the Democrats' answer, to this, right? Really kind of playing almost, on identity politics, choosing a woman of color, a black woman, to run with Biden, but really not offering, again, in my opinion, a program that really is speaking to the real needs of black Americans. So what do you make of this phenomenon of Democrats, I feel like, kind of playing on this identity politic, but not really offering anything really to answer the material reality of millions of black Americans right now who, of course, are dealing with the brunt of this economic crisis and of this pandemic?
Well, I think that the figure of Senator Harris also exposes and reveals the contradictions of the system. Because on the one hand, as you suggest, her record with regard to criminal justice issues when she was district attorney in San Francisco was far from exemplary, particularly this draconian crackdown on parents of truant children. But at the same time, since she's been nominated to be the running mate of Mr. Biden, she's been subjected to scurrilous attacks by Mr. Trump himself, referring to her as a monster, referring to her falsely and incorrectly and improperly as a, quote, socialist, unquote, which was meant to appeal to the baser sentiments of a certain segment of the electorate in South Florida. And of course, she's also been subjected to a certain kind of misogyny, a certain kind of sexism. And since this is a family program, I'll spare your tender ears from repeating some of the defaming words that have been targeted at her. And this, in turn, I'm afraid to say, has driven many to her defense, because people do not want to be associated with that kind of right-wing attack. But once again, this is part of the contradiction of the system that we live in, that it throws up these unappealing alternatives, for example, either voting for a neo-fascist or voting for a neoliberal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a blind alley, a cul-de-sac. I don't know. We can find one of those metaphors that certainly speaks to the phenomenon that I think people feel every 4 years. I mean, it seems as if the ball almost never really advances on the question, but certainly I guess we'll see if history advances the ball for us here in terms of what's really necessary. I mean, maybe this is it's a tough question to answer. It's very hypothetical, but I do always wonder this when we see, to me, what seems like a clear disconnect between the mass sentiment of at least many, many millions of people, certainly the base of those considered to be Democrats, and what we see in terms of the political dispensation and the politics that they represent is what possibility is there of political realignment in what seems like obviously two broad coalitions that are even internally deeply at odds?
Well, I would like to think that that's possible. Maybe I'm naive, maybe I'm overly optimistic. But for example, when I look at the response in the Black community to these elections that took place on Tuesday, November 3rd, I find quite a bit of outrage. And it's across ideological lines. That is to say, not only outrage amongst the radical left and the socialist-oriented folk, but even outrage amongst the moderates and amongst the liberals. Oftentimes, a political realignment is preceded by that kind of mass outrage. It seems to me that in light of the fact that the Black community oftentimes has been the spearhead of dramatic change, think of the 1960s and the civil rights movement, which then helps to turbocharge the anti-Vietnam War movement, we begin to see the possibilities and the prospects that may be before us. And I think it's also important to add that this is an outgrowth of the fact that when you're talking about the Black community, ultimately you're talking about an unresolved class question. That is to say that when you're talking about the Black community, overwhelmingly and disproportionately, you're talking about the descendants of enslaved Africans. And unlike some of the other folks who work for a living, who I made reference to a few moments ago, there was hardly a tendency amongst the bulk of enslaved Africans to engage in class collaboration with their slave masters. That's one of the reasons we've been penalized and pulverized so often. For example, we did not engage in class collaboration in 1776 and join George Washington in the attempt to overthrow a London regime that was thought to be moving by the settlers too rapidly towards abolition of slavery. And this continues up through the Civil War, where once again, we do not join with the slave owners so that they can perpetuate slavery forevermore. That tendency is still with us. That helps to explain why the Black community tends to vote against the right wing, a higher percentage than any other sector of the US electorate. And so that creates possibilities for that kind of realignment that you just made reference to.
Dr. Gerald Horn, professor and author, it's an honor to have you join us on Breakthrough. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, of course. Well, anyone watching this live stream right now, this circus, this chaos, whatever you want to call it, continued. Make sure you hit that share button. And if you aren't already, make sure you're following us on social media. We'll give you a second to do that right now at BT Newsroom on Instagram and on Twitter. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook by searching Breakthrough News for YouTube. Make sure you're subscribed to us and hit that little alert button so you can get notified as soon as we post new content. And we have a few more.
Well, you know, I think one thing I just want to say, since we're talking about content, not to interrupt you, but I do think it's important to note, when we are here to the second night in a row on a live stream, I am very, very excited to have everyone here, especially everyone who's here again. But we are funded by you. We are not, obviously I said there's no corporate spend, there's also no corporate paymaster. So we definitely would also love for you to go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and absolutely do whatever you can to support us. There's a different range of things things you can do. You can get a lot of great stuff, including these fantastic mugs. But whatever you can do, we will greatly appreciate it. Big shout out to everyone who's been a patron for us so far, because quite frankly, without your help, we would not be able to do anything we're doing, including these live streams, including bringing on people like Dr. Gerald Horn, and like many of the guests we had last night, and like many of the guests we will have on here this evening. And we are going to move forward here on that note. Next, we want to bring in Lee Camp, who, among other things, is the host of Redacted Tonight. Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, good to see you, Eugene.
Hey, well, the pleasure is all ours to have you here. I mean, you know, there's so many different things that are, I think, going through all of our minds in the context of what's going on with this election. And as we said at the outset, we still don't know 100% what the outcome will be in terms of the presidential election. There are still some outstanding issues to be determined, including the vote in Pennsylvania and Nevada, perhaps most notably. But I mean, maybe I'll just ask you first and foremost, Lee, are you surprised that this is the case? I think that there was so much of a conversation of a blue wave. The polls said XYZ. You're a very savvy person, though, so I don't know if you took that with a grain of salt from the beginning.
Yeah, I'm sad to say, you know, I don't consider myself all that intelligent, but I called all of this. I had forgotten when exactly I had tweeted it out, but someone reposted it for mid-August, August 14th. I said, for those of you who don't understand, here's what's going to happen. Trump is sowing doubt about the mail-in votes. He's gutting the USPS further, although the Democrats helped do that back in 2006. And he wants his people to vote on the day of so that there'll be mass chaos and confusion when the other votes come in. He'll declare victory the night of. And I said all of that. And yeah, here we are. We're going through it all exactly as it seemed. And the other thing that you know, I've been talking about for years, because I've been big on the election integrity front and those news stories. And you know, it kind of sucks to be like, oh yeah, Biden and Trump are two sides of the same coin. They stand for about 80-90% of the same structural issues in this country and globally, and yet here I am defending the outcome of this election because I simply want election integrity. And I've talked a lot about voter suppression, the millions of people that are purged from the voter rolls. Greg Palast does great investigative journalism on it. And he did succeed in getting interstate crosscheck finally stopped, but that did not stop, of course, the endless purging of mainly people of color and young people from the voter rolls. So when they were running around, you know, 538.com and all these polling sites and things saying, oh, it's going to be a blue wave, I, as always, said, yeah, those polls are always wrong, and they're always wrong for the same reason, voter suppression, people purged from the rolls, and yet again, the media all fell for it. And even when they say, oh, wow, the polls were wrong, they still won't really talk about voter suppression and voter purging.
Mm-hmm. Mark?
Yeah, Lee Camp, I just want to say I'm happy to have you on the show. I've been really looking forward to it. I think you're hilarious and sharp, and I really loved your take consistently on this issue of Russiagate. The night before the election, the Department of Justice just kind of snuck it out there, this previously unknown piece of the Mueller investigation, showing that there was no evidence that Julian Assange worked with Russia on the alleged hack of the DNC. Now, obviously, you know, this is really one of the final nails of the coffin of the Russiagate hoopla. You know, Dems made an entire campaign out of this, calling Trump a Russian spy, but it didn't come up at the Democratic National Convention earlier this summer. It wasn't really even highlighted on the Biden campaign trail all of these months. So what do you think, all of this combined, what does this really say about the truth, the validity of this Russiagate scandal, conspiracy, whatever you would want to call it?
Yeah, I mean, Russiagate and the neo-McCarthyism that it's part of were designed to, really purge the Democratic Party of the true progressives and get those of us on the true left, removed from the media, which my channels and hopefully, I know yours is kind of new. Hopefully, you don't yet suffer from that suppression, but you'll get there. Just keep striving, and you guys will be equally suppressed. He'll be equally suppressed, but it really did. It really did serve to basically malign anyone who would dare stand for real progressive ideals, as either Russia connected, Russian assets, or Russia sympathizers, or whatever you have. And many channels were purged, and then of course there's a shadow banning, which I've been heavily a victim of, but. Looking at the election, the Democrats created this imaginary world where they could run around and say anything that criticizes them or anything is Russia created, and yet that doesn't help them in an election. And the voters didn't really care. Right. And the truth is, if they had actually impeached Trump or gone after Trump for legitimate crimes like war crimes, the Emoluments Clause, et cetera, which he, of course, is violating all kinds of laws, they could have not only accurately impeached him, but they could have stopped Amy Coney Barrett from getting on the Supreme Court, because that would have, the impeachment trial would have superseded any approval of a Supreme Court justice. But of course, the Dems aren't going to do that, because they're either fine with those crimes like war crimes, or they're part and parcel to them. So they weren't going to do that, and they allowed the Supreme Court justice to be forced onto the court before an election. And it just goes to show that the Dems, I mean, it was a completely cynical move, Russiagate, from the beginning. And as you said, the latest unredacting of some of the Mueller report has been quietly covered up by the election, but it showed that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did not work with Russia in order to reveal the DNC emails, which were all completely true. And this is very similar, just real quick, this is very similar to when they dropped almost all of the indictments that they had against the Russian clickbait agency that they claimed had somehow manipulated our election last time around. They quietly dropped them on a Friday when no one was paying any attention, because they knew that they had, Mueller and his team had no real evidence that clickbait farm was somehow part of the Russian government and part of a Russian program to rig the election.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of the Supreme Court there as well. We've got a viewer on YouTube wondering your thoughts, Lee, about whether or not Trump will succeed if he can get the Supreme Court to take these various different election challenges he is mounting in a range of states.
Well, what little justice we still get out of our criminal injustice system, I do think that most judges seem very reluctant to overturn an election based on zero evidence. So I think that through all these lawsuits that he's throwing up around the country, which, it's hilarious because he wants to keep them keep the votes counting in Arizona because he thinks he can overtake Biden, but he wants to stop the vote counting in Pennsylvania and Georgia because he wants to keep his lead, which shows how cynical this is. But there's no evidence of anything he's claiming. And even the lawsuit that he put forward in Georgia was, he said someone claimed there was 53 ballots that had been put on the wrong pile to be counted. And I mean, even if he succeeded in that, you'd undo 53 votes or something. I mean, it's just laughable. As little as I like Biden or Trump, it seems quite clear that Biden has won this election.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And as BuzzFeed was reporting today, that Trump has told all of his aides to just go down fighting, to just file whatever they can, however frivolous, however ridiculous. Again, I don't want to look too far ahead because obviously we're still waiting to see what happens, but I tend to agree with you. It certainly seems to be leaning in the direction of Biden. But I almost feel that a lot of people, Lee, think, okay, well, if Biden gets in there, that the page is 100% turned, as if Trump is going away. And it seems to me there could almost be the opposite effect because, of course, Trump, no matter what happens, will never admit admit that he actually lost. Of course, there will always be something. It seems very unlikely he would just disappear. So it almost feels that he could become, in opposition, obviously not as powerful a force in terms of sort of the levers of power, but perhaps in terms of his cultural, social, political influence and what he can drive, be as dangerous as ever.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not as dangerous as ever. At least he won't be a push away from the trigger, but the red button. But yeah, he could be quite dangerous as kind of just a pro-fascist force in America. I don't know whether this opens him up to be allowed to, I guess it does, opens him up to be allowed to run again in 4 years or something. But I mean, let's remember that we've if Biden gets in, we've succeeded in stopping the neo-fascist by putting in the system that created the neo-fascist. So the question is, will people stand up against this neoliberal, government, or will we continue to basically just allow it to vomit up leaders like Donald Trump? It very much could give rise to another Trump or give rise to Trump yet again in 4 years. So I'd love to see people actually have the time now, because they're not all focused on Trump, to stand up and fight back. But it's that double-edged sword. When Trump's in office, all people focus on is the shiny object of Trump. They don't look at the system. They don't protest against pipelines. They just protest against Trump. And when Trump's not in office, they think, oh well, it's going to be fine because Biden's going to fix our world, which is absolutely not true.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you 100%. I've asked this question to a lot of people so far. I'm certainly curious your thoughts about this. The role of the media, obviously during this campaign, obviously during the Trump administration, there's a lot to be said there. I think many of the problems you might identify certainly go back further than that. But when we talk about sort of people's perception of reality, who they back, who they support, what they think is happening, maybe I'll ask you this in another way. I mean, I felt thinking about this last night that the way the media, for instance, in the Democratic primary was basically using all Republican talking points to counter Bernie Sanders, framing every question with, 100% conservative right-wing assumptions, rather than ever turning it around in the other way, that kind of stuff actually really conditions people for the way they view and see and shape the world. I mean, I don't want to say people are just automatons and they do nothing, but I mean, I'm curious your thoughts about the role of the media in this election, and even just shaping the environment in which Trump both arose and, even though he may lose, to some degree thrived over the past 4 years.
Yeah, I think that sadly that's the big victory of this election cycle, is proving the corporate media can install their choice and stop Trump, which they failed to do last time around. But they kind of they don't realize that or at least they won't acknowledge it, that they create the monster that they then are the Mick resistance against. They gave the final numbers in 2016. Obviously, we don't have the final numbers for this election, but the final numbers in 2016 were that they gave 10 times as much coverage to Trump as Hillary Clinton, and they gave 23 times as much coverage to Trump as Bernie Sanders during the primaries. So they really gave him the free coverage that enabled him to win that election and run this country. And of course, they've never acknowledged that. They've never apologized for it. In a lot of ways, they nearly recreated it yet again. But to your other point, these, the debate. I did a segment on Redacted tonight that was about the debates, but it's really about our media as a whole, that they give us the window of allowable thought. Some people know the term the Overton window, but they act like there's a debate. There are two sides of every issue, but those two sides all happen within a window of acceptable American thought. And as long as you're debating within that window, then you're really fine to the ruling elite. You're really not a threat to them, which is, why we saw Joe Biden say, I'm not a socialist. And like the idea of socialism is supposed to be anathema to anything that could ever gain any power in America. And the fact that Bernie Sanders at least brought that term back into the common zeitgeist is testament to what he achieved, even though he failed in the end. But they are telling you what is allowable to have the edges of the discussion, and I always try and be outside of those edges, because if you're debating within that window, you've already lost.
Yeah.
Lee, speaking
please.
of alleged socialist squad members, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Presley, of course, have all been reelected and are now joined by Black Lives Matter activists, progressive from Missouri, Cori Bush, and right here in New York, Jamal Bowman. What do you think is really the potential for this small progressive wing of the Democratic Party to really make a wave or push forward anything truly progressive in Congress in the next couple of years? Because we see things like Medicare for all, canceling student loan debt, free public education for all of these things that are so, just as we were speaking to, so outside of the political imagination of the United States, becoming more and more popular. And of course, both establishment parties refusing to offer a program that speaks to those wants and needs of the American people. So what do you believe is the potential of this new squad to really make a difference?
Yeah, I do believe there is some potential there, but it probably depends on how much, as they become, longer-term Congress people, if they stay in office, how much they are kind of captured by the corporate state, whether they realize it or not. There's kind of levels of erosion of your beliefs that happen the moment you get into Congress. On day one in Congress, Ocasio-Cortez was protesting outside Nancy Pelosi's office. She, joined, I guess it was Sunrise Movement or something, but she's, standing on a table as part of a protest, and then slowly gets eroded. I still think she's doing a lot of good work, but some of it not so much. And so it's a question of whether you're able to, once you're in the system, whether you're able to keep those beliefs or whether you slowly shed them to be more acceptable to our system as a whole. You take the Green New Deal, and the Green New Deal started as a Green Party idea that had a lot of teeth and was very important, and then it gets picked up by some of the progressives in the Democratic Party, and still has some important issues in it, but a lot of the kind of more important aspects of the Green New Deal, like the fact that the military is the largest polluting organization in the world, the U.S. military, is kind of wiped from the Green New Deal, so it gets slowly eroded, and then it gets eroded further by Nancy Pelosi never allowing it to actually gain any traction, calling it the Green Dream or whatever, as she said, and so you see this kind of erosion even of ideas. And the question is how much they can keep those beliefs and keep those ideas and not allow themselves to be captured by our kind of standard corporate state to become what is considered acceptable in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very well taken points on a number of different fronts there. Lee Camp, host of Redacted tonight. Fantastic show. I can absolutely recommend it to everyone who is watching here tonight. Really appreciate you joining us here on Breakthrough.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, pleasure was all ours. And, some good points there made by Lee, Monica, in terms of the makeup of Congress, mentioning Nancy Pelosi and those things. One thing that's certainly worth noting here, how significant it is compared to what it was before. Difficult to say given some of these people who are in here, but some serious far-right individuals coming in. I mean, Marjorie Greene, who is most notable, of course, for the whole QAnon issue and being a big supporter of that, but obviously deeply Islamophobic. I believe has made some anti-Semitic remarks. You got the guy Madison Cawthorn. Many people knew him. He was at the RNC, the young man, he's 25, I think the youngest ever congressperson in the wheelchair, who stood up, who has one of the most bizarre pictures on his Facebook page of him visiting the Eagle's Nest, Hitler's vacation home, and he's talking about how he crossed it off his bucket list. I don't really know what kind of person is like, let me think of all the things I want to do before I die.
Just like taking a selfie at the Eiffel Tower. Why wouldn't you want to visit Hitler's hideaway home?
Maybe he just loves the alpine air. I don't know. But these are some of the people who they're bringing in. And even some of the people who lost, Laura Loomer, what a complete joke. Obviously gets blown out. But the fact she can even become a candidate, for those who don't know, just a Islamophobic right-wing prank art. I don't even know what to call her, but nevertheless, she lost, so maybe it doesn't matter. But I mean, I think that is an interesting factor to see that even in the context of the Republicans losing the presidential election, the fact that they keep the Senate, the fact that they increase their minority, and that they seem to be, more in the image of Trump, moving more to the right and becoming deeper. I don't know how many, big conclusions we can draw from that, but it does seem like a relevant factor of this whole situation for me when we think about where we are tonight, the day two, basically 24 hours from where we were last night when we were calling this election.
Right, Eugene. I mean, in this election, we were given a choice between a right-wing candidate and a far right-wing candidate, hands down. I mean, instead of, again, really answering to the very real needs of 140 million Americans who, before the pandemic, even before this economic crisis, were living near or below the poverty line, instead of answering to the cries for Medicare for all, the cries for defunding the police, the cries for a Green New Deal, which Lee Camp just spoke so well on. I mean, we have seen this continued rightward trend in American politics. And one thing that the uprising of this summer against police brutality, I think, has really just revealed and put in such plain sight about the nature of the U.S. capitalist state is that this system has no answers to its own contradictions. We saw a popular movement against police brutality, demanding justice for killer cops, be met with the same brutality from police that it was protesting against. I keep saying it, but it's just still mind-blowing to see Black Lives Matter protesters be brutalized in these Black Lives Matter plazas popping up in D.C., in New York City, in Portland. I mean, just what a glaring indictment of really the foundation of this system, and the fact that, again, neoliberalism, it has no answer to these contradictions. It could just be so easy for them to simply move a little bit to the left, just a little bit. I mean, we're not saying Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. He's not even a democratic socialist. He's actually a true liberal, if we're really going to talk about in the truest sense. Or maybe a little more to maybe a little more left to liberal. But I mean,
it's over for him anyway. Sorry to Bernie Sanders fans, but I'm sorry, he's irrelevant at this point. I mean, we could get into it, but he is. Anyway, continue.
I mean, yeah, it was just funny seeing a tweet from Biden earlier today talking about power cannot be taken, and it's like, oh, like the DNC took the nomination from Bernie to 2 election cycles in a row. I mean, really, it just goes to, again, reveal the true nature of the character of both establishment parties, that they are two sides of the same coin, that they are both really funded by Wall Street, funded by these same multinational billionaire, trillionaire corporations. I mean, this is more money than the human mind could even conceptualize. It's ridiculous. So it's just very clear to me, time and time again, that the Democrats would rather move further and further to the right. They would rather wine and dine and win over Republicans. Again, if the Democrats really cared about reaching their base, if they really cared about representing the people whose votes they feel so entitled to, like the Black community, they would actually, I don't know, look to some of these progressives, look to people in the squad, like I just mentioned, for these cabinet positions. But who's Biden looking at? Republicans like himself. Yeah, if we're really going to be honest.
Dredging, it's like the crypt keeper or something like that, the people they're bringing out from nowhere, from the Bush administration. I mean, the worst possible people on so many different fronts. I mean, I think you make such a good point, because the reality is Biden's entire career has been predicated on being the most right-wing Democrat. I mean, he comes in at a time where he's opposing the expansion of desegregation, where he's promoting mass incarceration. Obviously, he was in the front line of constructing the crime bill, as many other things.
He's
but also,
sorry, though.
He's kind of sorry. But that's the other thing, is he's kind of sorry. It took him until I think the last month to even kind of apologize. And then his entire attitude, just shoot him in the leg, like shoot to maim. Like, yeah, don't kill anyone, just maim them for life.
Don't kill these peaceful protesters.
Just everything. Honestly, it really is such a blast from the past to even listen to him. Obviously, those politics at one point were, relatively regnant, as it were, in the Democratic Party. But it really is unbelievable. But, let me not editorialize too much and leave another guest on the line. But I do just want to say here really quickly, if you are watching, we are still going to go for a little bit longer. We've got more here on the show. So if you get a chance, share this right now wherever you are watching so everyone can see it. And definitely subscribe so you can get notifications about everything we have going on. And please become a patron, patreon.com/breakthrough news, because that's the only way we're funded. That's the only way we can have great content. That's the only way we can do things like bring you Dr. Jody Dean, who, among other things, is the author of Comrades, who we want to bring on here next. Only can do that with your support. Patreon.com/breakthrough news. Dr. Jody Dean, thank you for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. I mean, yeah, as you probably have been doing all day, I mean, there's so many different threads and so many different things that we can pick up on. I mean, obviously there's the presidential race where, for those who maybe are just tuning in, you could argue that it's still deadlocked. It could go in many different ways. President Trump is, of course, launching a number of legal challenges in a number of states, but it does at least seem to be trending towards President Biden. The Republicans have held the Senate. They have expanded their minority. So you've expanded their minority. I don't know if that's really that notable, but nevertheless they have, when many people did not expect it. So relatively good night for Republicans, Jody Dean, last night, because obviously they were expected by the polls to be completely wiped out. I think many people are surprised, many people are angry, many people are shocked, many people are not surprised at all given who the Democrats are. Where do you stand 24 hours later?
I'm actually not surprised that the Republicans did as well as they did. I thought that it was going to be very close. The trend lines for Biden had been going down for over a week, right, when you looked at the polling averages. And then it was also the case that, strangely, even though all of the media was saying, it's going to be this blue wave, it's going to be a landslide, when you talk to people were really nervous. People, particularly liberal Democrats, they didn't have a kind of optimistic feeling we're going to win, even as the mainstream media was saying, all of the odds are in their favor. So I'm not surprised that it has been as close as it is. I don't think anybody's surprised that Trump declared a version of victory last night. I don't think anybody's surprised that he is fighting in the courts. I mean, he said he was going to do this. He said that he essentially that if he lost, they were going to fight it as far as they could, because the only way they could lose is if something happened with the ballots. I mean, honestly, it's called voting, but from his perspective, is all of these ballots were going to make him lose the election, and so they were going to fight it tooth and nail. So I don't think any of this is surprising, and I hope that this will make the Democrats actually reflect, just to be a little blunt, on how pathetic their party is and their candidate is, because if they couldn't beat Trump more handily than this, they're lacking, right? Mm-hmm. They really are a disappointment. If they don't have more to offer to the majority of people in this country, then honestly, they should be grateful that they scraped by, and should be bending over backwards to say, yes, we will now deliver to the people the kinds of things that we know the majority wants. Our own polling says the majority wants Medicare for all. The majority wants a kind of end to foreign wars and U.S. militarism and a wasting money on all of this imperialism, when instead it should be building the social welfare net, particularly given COVID, right? When it should be guaranteeing people's incomes while they've been furloughed, right? Rather than giving the handouts to corporations, when we should be, eliminating the people's debts and making sure that the rents and mortgages are canceled. Mm-hmm. So I think that the Democrats need to be essentially crawling to their base on bended knee, saying, yes, we know we nearly lost this, and we're going to do our best to try to be better. Now, I don't think they will, but that's what they should do. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Jody Dean, I think you're exactly right. And I want to ask you about something that we've been covering here on Breakthrough very closely, and that is Proposition 22 in California, a $200 million campaign from gig economy giants like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash in California, who literally wrote this proposition to basically change the status of gig economy workers from independent contractors to employees. The polling had a really tight race going into last night's elections, and it's really a shame to see gig economy workers in California lose their right to unionize, lose their right to overtime pay, lose their right to a livable wage, among many other things. And unfortunately, this is the norm when it comes to referendums in this capitalist democracy. We see billionaire corporations just flooding millions of dollars into the airwaves with a really united message, and again, hundreds of millions of dollars into propaganda to misinform voters, essentially, and threaten to eliminate tens of thousands of jobs if they lose. I mean, what is democracy in the United States if a dollar can buy it?
Oh, God, I'm so glad you brought this up. I've been thinking a lot about the Prop 20 vote and Prop 22 vote today, Monica, and it's so deeply distressing that it even passed, right? I mean, it shouldn't have even been bought, but California has long been at the forefront of these utterly regressive ballot initiatives that are funded by the right wing. The massive amounts of money is poured into it, and it's always an attack on the social welfare net, an attack on the working class, and this one in particular is really bad because it makes us see how so many people in California are the ones who voted for this are more likely to see themselves as like some kind of entrepreneur or new Jeff Bezos or new Steve Jobs or something, rather than think about themselves as, no, we're actually more like factory workers, right? We are actually workers, and we should stand together as workers and have the kind of solidarity we need as workers. Instead, they fall for this kind of illusion that, oh no, being an independent contractor means you're free, but they're not free, right? Then they're even more subjected to the dictates of the market. They have their wages actually decline. They have no security, no health insurance of any sort. So I think it's completely sad and a very disturbing tendency, and kind of lets us know about what's on the horizon if people actually don't organize more strongly and fight back. Because California is always it's like a precursor of what else is likely to come.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true, and we certainly saw the legacy of that last night as well. The issue of affirmative action, which of course California, believe it or not, you know this well, Jody, was one of the forefronts in eliminating affirmative action in higher education. An attempt to turn some of that back failed. An attempt to deal with rent control failed. So the number of sort of issues that I think we have seen sort of move from the margins to the center from California, and that perception certainly of the largest state, the largest economy, different pieces like that. You can go the other way too, obviously, on emissions and things, but I think that's a very notable, very well taken point. I mean, the flip side of that coin in some ways, and I'm not even 100% sure where my question is here, but I do think it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and the idea that consciousness isn't exactly linear. I mean, you look at Florida, where obviously Trump won, but the $15 an hour minimum wage passed. You look at a number of these states where people who obviously, some of them voted for Republicans, were willing to, put at least a partial crimp in the war on drugs. That, I mean, it just seems like that we simplify everything down, Jody, to blue or red, Republican or Democrat, but that there's something much more complex and much more important, perhaps in many ways, going on, and the ability to both understand it, but to also put it in an understandable framework seems crucial for people who do want to see transformative change moving forward.
Oh yeah, we could, as socialists, we'll call this dialectical, right? So the struggle is real, right? The same moments where people are going right, other people are going in a different direction. I mean, I think that Oregon's ballot initiatives here have been really, really great, because they're undercutting the basis of the war on drugs, which has obviously been a war against people of color, a war against working class people. I mean, it's rarely a war against elite college students doing coke in their rooms. It goes, those are not the people who get prosecuted for drugs. And once you start eliminating the criminal basis for this stuff, then you can really defeat it. So I'm excited about Oregon, and I think that we can see like the struggle that bears out. I mean, it's very hard for the U.S. political system to really register the struggle that comes from below, right? It so tries to block and insulate itself from anything but the struggles within the ruling class or within the bourgeoisie. But still, sometimes it sneaks through. And the minimum wage also, wasn't it Florida that in the last few elections was able to give formerly incarcerated people return their right to vote to them, which is also important. So they take with one hand and give with the other one.
Yeah, I think that's extraordinarily important, and just for people to note, in Florida, those constitutional amendments require supermajorities, so over 60% have to vote for them. So it's always pretty significant again, in a good or a bad way, depending on what it is, but certainly a bellwether. And I think those are great points. And, we didn't mention this last night, and I forgot to mention it. I wanted to mention it, and I'm glad you brought up Oregon. Jody, I'm going to get it wrong, so cancel me in advance, people of Portland. But the county that surrounds Portland, Multnomah County, I think it is, also passed a very interesting ballot measure there locally, which will tax wealthier people in order to provide childcare, which I think is super important. And Colorado, it does look like paid family leave did exist. And I mean, that's another one of those issues that you think, like, how are we in the richest country in the history of countries, and the issue of paid family leave is still out there as some sort of controversial issue, but nevertheless want to note that the people of Colorado turned it back. Well, let me also ask you this, Jody, in terms of looking forward and where people are looking. I mean, I actually haven't seen a ton of despair in response to this. I've certainly seen anger, frustration, sadness, but I have seen, in many ways, a fighting spirit. I mean, how important is that kind of spirit moving forward? I mean, I know a lot of people will, in many ways rightfully, be relieved that it looks like Trump isn't going to win. Let's just assume he doesn't. But it's hard to look at, a Biden presidency, maybe with some Republican cabinet members, a hard right Supreme Court, and a hard right Senate, and a larger minority of Republicans in the House, and think like, yeah, Washington, D.C., the fake Washington, D.C., not the real D.C., shout out to D.C., statehood now, will really be the center of change here. How important is that fighting spirit, both sort of, obviously just as a spirit, but in terms of really manifesting?
One of the things I think we've seen over the past year is that there's a massive fighting spirit in the country. It doesn't have much to do with elections, right? It doesn't think that elections is where the real struggle is. So for the movements in the revolt against racism and the attack on racist policing, that's been huge. And it's not been around ballots. It's been around, justice for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Daniel Prude. It's been against the police's continuing, murder of Black people. So I think that we're going to continue to see that kind of energy out there, because that doesn't get co-opted by the Democratic mantra of vote, vote, vote all the time. It's a much more fundamental kind of struggle. I think the same thing is going to be true with environmental and climate politics, which did not do all that well in the election. We can hope that Biden will re-enter the U.S. in the Paris Climate Accord. But that's going to require also, I think, fighting in the streets. And the same thing, like, we don't have any kind of guarantee from the Democrats about what's going to happen with rents and mortgages. That's still there. Right? It's still going to be the case that rent's going to come due, and the Congress never passed a second bailout for the people with this. So the election doesn't change that. And one other thing on this, Mitch McConnell's still there, and I hope that people are tired enough of the Democratic Party being a party of non-fighters and a party that says, you remember during part of the Obama year, it's like, well, we don't have 60, or we don't have this, we don't have that, we can't do anything, even though they had a majority in the Senate. And it's highly unlikely that I think that the Democrats are going to take the Senate. And if they do, it's only going to be by 1 or 2 votes who are not necessarily going to be very reliable. So Mitch McConnell's there. Defeating Trump does not mean that there's going to be smooth sailing. And so it's going to be time, I think, for everybody, in the broad scope of progressives, from the left wing, the Democratic Party, and the squad, like Monica was mentioning, all the way through, the wide array of socialists who are not working inside the party. We're going to have to push and push and push and remind the Democrats that, in fact, they owe everyone else. Their position is very precarious.
Jody, I want to throw it back a little bit to your response to my question about Prop 22, because it reminded me of this quote from John Steinbeck. Socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Of course, the Bernie Sanders campaign, brought about this resurgence of, at least a national conversation on socialism, socialism being the most Googled word of 2016. And of course, you are a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, who ran Gloria La Riva, who we were honored to be joined by and speak with last night. She had received, this is not the most up-to-date number, but from what I'm seeing right here from earlier today, over 51,000 votes across 15 states and Washington, D.C. What do you feel about what a rising socialist movement could look like in the U.S. and what it would really take to really bring about, again, a movement for something that has been considered, the biggest boogeyman, in U.S. politics, really?
What's been exciting, I think, about the resurgence of socialism is the way that now a majority of people under 40 don't think socialism is a bad thing. And I think that Gloria La Riva's success, even getting on the ballot in 15 states is a fantastic achievement. Getting write-in status in another 14 or 15 states, that's also a big achievement. And the reason that's an achievement is that's the stuff that involves like talking to people and people going out in the neighborhoods and out in the streets and talking with people one-on-one and face-to-face. And many people who probably had never met a socialist before, and they start to learn about the issues and they start to realize like, oh, there are people out there who speak to me, who hear me, who speak my language. And so it's that I think is going to make this socialist movement that we have right now, that's starting to get more and more energy, that's going to make it take off, is the fact that there's been this campaign. And in fact, actually in down ballot, a number of down ballot candidates from DSA were able to win. That's good. Are they going to build socialism from within the Democratic Party and the American political system? Highly unlikely. But are they like little flag posts that can help give more attention to it? Absolutely. So I think that as we're out in the movements, out in the struggles, and people start to see that, oh yeah, without socialism, we can't solve the country's problems. And I think that this election actually proves that the way the Democrats are barely scraping by, and they don't have a program that can solve the problems. People know that. People didn't want to see another round of Trump, but they also, I don't think, have any illusions about the Democrats being able to solve the problems. And I think that the kind of general unenthusiasm for Biden, but people's willingness to vote, shows that they're open for change. And that's actually one of the good things about this system. This election is the system hasn't worked. The system is like fragmenting and frail. And honestly, any system that has, depends on, was dependent on one 86 or 87-year-old woman who'd had cancer 5 times to keep a court together, right? That's not a system. Any system that, has much older men who don't speak to the majority of the people, that's not a system. And I think people know that, and that's a good opening for us.
Dr. Jody Dean, professor of political science. You can follow her at Jody7768. Thank you so much for joining us the second night in a row on our live stream here on Breakthrough. We appreciate your time.
Take care, y'all. Thanks.
All right, if you have not already, viewers, we implore you, please click that share button now. This is news, this is perspective, this is analysis. You're not going to get anywhere else in the corporate media. If you aren't already, make sure you're following us on social media at BT Newsroom, on Twitter and Instagram. You can find us on Facebook and YouTube. Breakthrough News on YouTube. Turn on those notifications and subscribe so you can get notified immediately as soon as we're posting new content. And of course, we need your help. We need your support to continue the important work that we're doing here at Breakthrough. We are the media arm of the movement, and we need your support as patrons. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Becoming a patron will give you access to exclusive content, gifts, our monthly podcast, these cute mugs you see us adorned with on every live stream. We really appreciate all of our current patrons. And again, if you love the work that we're doing, if you appreciate the work that we're doing, even if you don't love it, even if you kind of like it, just check it out, patreon.com/breakthrough news. And we have 3 levels of giving monthly, and everything that that will entitle you to, you can check that out on our Patreon. We really appreciate your support, and frankly, we need it to keep it going, because as we mentioned, we are not corporate sponsored media, we are not corporate funded media, we are not beholden to any millionaire, any big donor. We are beholden to you viewers, to the movement, to the people on the ground fighting for change in this decrepit, falling apart system, as we are seeing in front of our very own eyes here in 2020. So check that out again, patreon.com/breakthrough news. And I think
now we're going to go to Mr. K. Pritzker, our third host here. Obviously, many people who were watching last night know that Kay is coming to us from deep underground in an undisclosed bunker somewhere. Kay, thank you for being with us again.
Of course, I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're glad. We're certainly glad. Very honored. There's there's so much on the table and there's so much to discuss here, and I think we've sort of maybe genuflected towards this in a little bit, but we haven't hit it directly. I think a lot of the context, Kay, that people are looking at the potential of a Biden presidency, which of course, again, looks relatively likely, although it's not 100% clear. A number of key states, or several key states, have not been called, but it does certainly look like it's leaning in that favor, although President Trump is trying to use various legal maneuvers. And as we saw at the outset of this show with the disrupting of the vote counting in Detroit, or the attempted disrupting of the vote counting in Detroit, the Republicans are using some thuggery there as well to attempt to get their way in this election. But to circle back around, Kay, a lot of the ways people are looking at a Biden presidency is like, well, he's terrible in every way, but we can push him to the left, so it's actually okay, it's going to be fine, because he will respond to the pleas of those who are opposed to the policies he will be pushing. I mean, I wonder how much of that you've seen in the discourse and how you're responding to it so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of dominated the discourse, this idea that we're going to push Biden to the left, and I think the reality is that Biden is already being pushed to the right, if not sprinting towards the right. We saw him in the debates, for example, just departing from a lot of any progressive policies he was getting behind. The banning fracking thing, probably the most notable, but also, there's this whole, now he has this whole policy, or this whole idea about bringing on Republicans to his cabinet, and he's saying, here's actually a direct quote behind this strategy, that he wants to stress the diversity of ideology and background is a core value of his transition. So he's going to bring on people like John Kasich, the anti-abortion, anti-union Republican who ran in the 2016 Republican primary. He's going to bring on Senator Jeff Flake, people like this. So I think there are already signs that Joe Biden is being pushed to the right. And of course, he's one of these candidates, one of these Democrats that has this philosophy of, running in the center, or running from a centrist position. That's, how you're going to get stuff done. That's how you're going to, get your goals accomplished, or what have you. But he's definitely not saying he's moving to the left. I mean, there's absolutely no indication of that. And I think, we should also think about how we got here. One person on Twitter was saying that, we have to reflect on the fact that Donald Trump, I mean, the rise of Donald Trump, we can partially hold Barack Obama's broken promises in 2008 and 2012. We have to hold the broken promises of this, this person who ran on a progressive platform in 2008, said he wasn't going to bail out the banks, says he wasn't going to increase surveillance, he was going to end the wars, this, that, and the other, and he went back on all of these promises. I think, just given that failure, I think a lot of people were disenchanted with the Democratic Party in 2016. And again this year, I think a lot of people are disenchanted with Joe Biden, who, quite frankly, I mean, he doesn't really stand for much besides not being Donald Trump. I don't think he really has a very passionate bone in his body, and he seems to just go whichever way his donors and the DNC leadership tell him to go.
Yeah, I think those are extraordinarily well taken points, Kay. I'd actually forgotten that John Kasich existed, but I mean, the former governor of Ohio, of course. But as you brought up, he was at the DNC. People may remember. It's coming back to me now. Standing in that just random field, God knows where, at like a literal fork in the road, and goes, "I know Joe. He won't go hard left." Why we would care or believe anything about that? What he's saying is unbelievable. I think that's a great point. Tom Ridge as well. I mean, the fact that you had the Washington Post story just a couple months before the election, where a Wall Street banker is telling the Post in a private meeting that the Biden campaign was having with rich donors, that they were telling people, well, don't worry about anything you are worried about in terms of what we're talking about, because that's just to appease the Warren people and the Sanders people. So just outright saying, we're totally lying, so don't worry about it at all, just cover for us while we're lying, tells us everything. But I guess here's the other question I have for you, Kay, is there also an opportunity in this? Because I think you could argue that, not only just the decrepit nature of the campaign that was run by Joe Biden, but what has been revealed, I think, about the bankruptcy of that kind of centrist liberalism to really, be able to rally the country and defeat this sort of semi-fascist hard right movement, that perhaps that could open up many more people's eyes just as much as it failed to be able to really deliver a major blow to the trend to the right that we've been seeing in this country for the past few elections.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I just want to say those quotes are quite jarring, and Biden actually leads Trump in terms of having endorsements from billionaires. He has 131 billionaires on his side, whereas Donald Trump, the billionaire himself, could only get 99. But he's definitely not a candidate that is fighting the rich or a threat to the billionaire class. But yeah, this really is an opportunity, and for organizers and for progressives. I understand where people are coming from. Like you said, we are facing this semi-fascist president who tonight is, sending his supporters out to literally stop voting. So I understand where people are coming from when they, want to just get him out of office and try to push Joe Biden left. But quite frankly, what we're going to see is that Joe Biden, because of his donors, because of pressure from the DNC leadership, because of his own admission that he's not a socialist, he's not going to fundamentally change things in America, we're going to see a massive divide between what progressives and what socialists are asking him to do and what he actually does. Like Jody pointed out, a lot of the policies that invigorate the DNC base. And, I don't even think it's just the DNC base. I think most Americans would support this. Things like universal health care, things like creating a pathway to citizenship for immigrants. I think these are policies that, especially in this pandemic, are incredibly meaningful to people. We're not going to see Biden trying to fight for those things. We're going to see him running to the center as he said he would. And I think these progressives who have this idea that they're going to, push Biden to push him to the left, they're going to be disappointed. But this is also going to be a learning moment. I mean, it's going to be a teaching moment where people will realize that Joe Biden is not, there's this idea that this is a democratic system, that politicians will listen to you and you just got to fight as hard as you can. But the reality is Joe Biden is bought and paid for by corporations. He's bought and paid for by rich people. And he's going to fight back. He's going to push back on a lot of these calls for progressive change. And, organizers are just going to have to dig in. And we're just going to have to fight harder. And we're just going to have to push back until the pressure on the administration is so strong that Joe Biden can't really get away with just ignoring our calls.
Kay, speaking to you, a member of our team, I'm just going to throw in a shameless plug. We've been covering the latest in labor organizing and union organizing over the past couple of months with our weekly segment on the picket line. Now, one of a great resource I've been using, paydayreport.com, has been covering really an unprecedented wave of strikes we've seen since the start of the pandemic. Payday Report has identified over 1,100 wildcat Democrat strikes since the beginning of March. I see the stunning headline, and this is from back in February, saying strikes are up 257% in 2 years. Now, of course, this is coinciding with this historic movement for Black lives, millions of Americans hitting the street, protests in small cities and suburbs that have never seen a rally before, let alone any kind of protest demanding accountability for killer cops and an end to racist policing. I really wonder what a movement under President Biden would look like, because if we're just watching the corporate media coverage and just listening to these liberal Wall Street bought talking heads, you would think, okay, if Trump wins, we got to hit the streets, the resistance 2.0. If Biden wins, go home, everything's okay, dystopia is over, everything is back to normal. So, okay, what do you think about what really uniting so many different struggles for social justice and for workers' rights would look like under a Biden presidency?
Yeah, I think we actually kind of got a little taste of it this summer during the uprising. So many of these cities where protesters were being tear gassed, were being mass arrested, were in cities with Democratic mayors, cities that these politicians that would support Joe Biden and would support his policies. And of course, Joe Biden himself also, is right on the side of Donald Trump, really, in terms of more funding to police, more repression. Of course, he said we should shoot protesters in their legs. I think it's not just Joe Biden. It's really the whole Democratic Party that represents this fake resistance. And people will learn that, this false idea that, just because Joe Biden got elected, now the dystopia is over. We can, we're going to get back on the track of progress.
Back to brunch.
This won't be true, we're still in a pandemic. We're still in this massive crisis, and people still need aid. We still need more stimulus, and people are going to demand that whether or not, Biden wins tonight or, in the future. Regardless of what happens with this election, people will still need that aid. And quite frankly, the Democrats have been very comfortable just sitting on their hands, going back and forth with the Republicans. No urgency whatsoever to bail out the people. Of course, the bailouts for the banks and the corporations came instantly. But, I think unions, people struggling in the anti-war movement, the anti-police brutality movement, they're going to find that nothing has really changed under the Democratic administration, and nothing will fundamentally change in any of these cities either, where Democratic mayors and Democratic politicians run the city. I think we're going to see the status quo be maintained, and people will have to come to grips with the fact that the Democrats are not an opposition party. They're not a progressive party. And we need to build a movement that is completely separate from this two-party system, which, quite frankly, is owned by the rich.
Yeah, no, well, Kay, I appreciate you. I appreciate you joining us again here tonight for our second night in a row of election analysis here. And, I just want to give some sense of where we are to people before we end up closing. It's unclear exactly when we will know when things will be fully wrapped up, as it were. As of right now, things seem to be trending towards former Vice President Joe Biden, who has 253 electoral votes, against current President Donald Trump, who has 214 electoral votes. But Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia all have not been called yet. That is where the game will be decided, it seems. Which way it's trending, it's hard to tell. I mean, even just recently, while we were having this conversation, there was something of a blue shift in Maricopa County in Arizona. That's where Phoenix is, more or less. It's many other things as well. But favoring Vice President Biden. The Trump campaign saying earlier today that they feel that most of the votes are out in Arizona are certainly going to favor them. And there are certainly some counties where there are very heavy Republican presences that have not submitted all their votes. And in fact, there could be 25% that's still out there. The same thing is also true in Pennsylvania, sort of base on base, as they say. I mean, obviously, you've got Philadelphia, which many people have been talking about, where there will be more votes, certainly, for former Vice President Biden. You've got places like Greene County, Erie County, more in the western part of the state, still with a decent decent amount of vote to come in there. It seems certainly likely that a big chunk of those will be for President Trump. Georgia pushing very hard to try to count all the votes as quickly as possible. There was a rumor that they actually stopped and went to sleep last night or something, and they're saying that that didn't happen. But they are pushing very aggressively, they say, to try to get the votes counted there. So Georgia could be called at some point later tonight. Again, that's one, who exactly knows? We have seen President Trump's lead in Georgia shrink pretty much all day. The lead for Senator Perdue also shrank pretty much all day, about at the 50% mark. And then, of course, we saw Reverend Raphael Warnock, the Democratic candidate in the Senate special election in Georgia, win by certainly a hair, but he certainly did win and go to a runoff there. So Georgia, another one that could go either way. North Carolina, same thing. But also, as we mentioned at the outset, President Trump has launched a flurry of lawsuits in a range of places. In Wisconsin, there almost certainly will be a recount. If there's less than a 1% difference, and there is less than a 1% difference, even though the state has been called for former Vice President Biden, you can request, it's basically an automatic recount essentially in the state of Wisconsin. So the Trump campaign will be requesting a recount. They claim that there were some irregularities. We shall see. In the state of Pennsylvania, there is an attempt to stop the vote count in the case of Nevada. They want to do more vote counting. So the Trump campaign is taking a range of contradictory positions, but at the end of the day, in many different states, what they're trying to do is anything that they think will prevent ballots that will be heavily Democratic from being counted, which is primarily, when we look at what's happening around the country, aimed at black voters, really black working class voters in many different ways. So again, we'll see if any of those lawsuits prevail. So far, we have not seen that. It's unclear if they will. President Trump is saying he wants to take some of this to Supreme Court. It's unclear if the Supreme Court will even take these cases, so that is an issue in and of itself. But that is, a bit of the landscape with where we are right now. But I think throughout the night, and certainly tomorrow morning, there will be some movement here. Certainly both people could potentially win, but it does look like former Vice President Joe Biden could squeak one out. It does seem that Republicans will hold their lead in the Senate, and it does seem like Republicans will have expanded their minority inside of the Senate as well. So a lot on the table, a lot to be said here, a lot more to happen, and we're going to have to keep watching it. But certainly on Breakthrough News, we will continue to keep watching it, which is why we have to ask you to go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, because that's the only way we will be able to keep watching it. With your support and your help, the fantastic support that our current patrons have given us is exactly why we're here right now, 2 nights in a row, helping you break down everything that's going on with this election. There's so much to talk about, so much to parse. Definitely keep watching us across all your social media at BT Newsroom. Subscribe so you get notifications. Just please, patreon.com/breakthrough news. We definitely need your support. The only way to continue to bring you the type of content that we are now. So, that will do it for us here in part 2 of our live show. Will there be a part 3? All I can say is follow BT Newsroom and make sure you subscribe, and you will find out yourself. And as we always say here on Breakthrough News, don't just watch us, join us.